The snow fell with the persistence of fate itself, transforming the Austrian Alps into a white labyrinth that seemed designed by Providence to trap the unwary. The Orient Express, that symbol of European elegance and precision, sat motionless in the mountain pass like a jeweled serpent caught in winter's coils. What had begun as a routine journey from Vienna to Calais had become, in the space of 3 hours, something far more sinister, a prison of mahogany and brass, sealed by nature's own hand. Inside the first-class dining car, the remnants of an excellent dinner lingered on pristine white tablecloths. Crystal glasses caught the warm glow of electric lamps, casting prismatic shadows that danced with each slight movement of the stranded train. The passengers, a carefully selected cross-section of European society, had initially treated their predicament with the sort of resigned good humor that wealth and breeding are supposed to provide. Bridge games had commenced in the salon car, brandy circulated with diplomatic frequency, and conversations maintained their civilized veneer despite the growing certainty that they would not reach their destinations as planned. Among these travelers was Mr. Augustus Fairfax, a man whose very presence seemed to disturb the equilibrium of any room he entered. At 62, Fairfax possessed the sort of sharp-featured handsomeness that suggested both intelligence and cruelty in equal measure. His reputation as a collector of rare manuscripts was matched only by his skill at acquiring them through methods that, while technically legal, often left former owners feeling as though they had been the victims of an elegant form of theft. He dined alone, as was his custom, observing his fellow passengers with the calculating gaze of a man who saw everything in terms of acquisition and advantage. The other passengers formed a constellation of European privilege and ambition around him. Lady Pemberton, a widow whose fortune in shipping had made her both powerful and paranoid, sat with her companion, Miss Hartwell, a pale woman whose nervous energies seemed to vibrate through her very bones. Count Andregni, traveling with his young wife Elena, maintained the sort of aristocratic bearing that suggested centuries of breeding, while Dr. Constantine, a Greek physician with tired eyes and gentle hands, had spent the evening in quiet conversation with Professor Buch, a Belgian archaeologist whose enthusiasm for ancient civilizations was matched only by his appreciation for fine wine. The American contingent was represented by Mr. Samuel Ratchet, a businessman whose expensive clothes could not quite disguise something unsavory in his past, and his secretary, Mr. McQueen, a nervous young man who seemed perpetually on the verge of apology. Mrs. Hubbard, a talkative widow from New York, had regaled anyone within earshot with stories of her travels, while Princess Dragomirov, a Russian émigré of formidable bearing, sat in regal silence, her jeweled fingers working methodically through a piece of embroidery. The train's staff, led by the impeccable Monsieur Buch, had maintained their professional composure despite the increasingly obvious fact that they were trapped until the storm passed and rescue could be arranged. The conductor, Pierre Michel, had made his rounds with mechanical precision, while the sleeping car attendants had prepared the compartments with their usual attention to detail. It was shortly after 11 o'clock when the scream shattered the civilized quiet of the stranded train. The sound came from compartment E, where Mr. Fairfax had retired after dinner with his customary dismissal of social pleasantries. It was not Fairfax who screamed. Indeed, Augustus Fairfax would never scream again. The cry of horror came from his valet Foster, a thin man whose devotion to his employer had been absolute and whose discovery of the body would haunt him for the remainder of his days. Fairfax lay sprawled across the narrow floor of his compartment, his evening clothes immaculate except for the spreading crimson stain that had soaked through his white shirt front. A thin-bladed knife, the sort used for opening letters, protruded from his chest with surgical precision. His face, which had worn its habitual expression of calculating disdain through dinner, now bore the slack features of death. His eyes, those sharp instruments of appraisal, stared sightlessly at the ornate ceiling of the railway car. The compartment itself told a curious story. Nothing appeared to have been disturbed. Fairfax's gold pocket watch still gleamed from his waistcoat. His wallet remained thick with banknotes, and his collection of rare manuscript photographs lay undisturbed on the small writing desk. The window was securely latched from within, its glass bearing a thick coating of ice that would have made entry from outside impossible, even if the train had not been moving when the crime occurred. The door had been locked from the inside, the key still in Fairfax's pocket. Dr. Constantine, summoned immediately by Monsieur Bouc, pronounced death to have occurred no more than an hour previously. The weapon, he observed with clinical detachment, had been inserted with remarkable accuracy, piercing the heart and causing almost instantaneous death. Whoever did this, he murmured to the assembled group, possessed either considerable anatomical knowledge or extraordinary fortune. As word of the murder spread through the stranded train, the atmosphere of resigned inconvenience transformed into something far more sinister. Passengers emerged from their compartments in various states of dress and undress, their faces pale in the flickering light of the corridor lamps. The civilized veneer of dinner conversation gave way to whispered speculation and barely concealed suspicion. Lady Pemberton clutched her companion's arm and demanded to know what security measures would be taken. Count Andreni drew his young wife closer, his aristocratic composure cracking slightly as he realized they were trapped with a murderer. Mrs. Hubbard's usual volubility deserted her entirely, while Princess Dragomarov observed the proceedings with the sort of imperial calm that suggested she had witnessed far worse things in her eventful life. The murder weapon itself presented its own mystery. The letter opener was of excellent quality, silver-plated with an ornate handle bearing the monogram O.E., the initials of the Orient Express itself. Such implements were provided in each first-class compartment as part of the railway's attention to detail, yet this particular knife bore a small scratch near the handle that several passengers claimed to recognize. Foster, the valet, provided what little information he could through his shock and grief. Mr. Fairfax had retired to his compartment at approximately 10:15, dismissing Foster's services for the evening with his usual curtness. Foster had gone to his own quarters in the second-class section, returning only when he heard what he thought was his employer calling for assistance. Finding the compartment locked, he had used his duplicate key, a privilege granted to personal servants, only to discover the terrible scene within. The locked room presented an immediate puzzle that seemed to defy rational explanation. How had the murderer entered a compartment secured from within? How had they escaped through a locked door, leaving the key in the victim's pocket? And most disturbing of all, if the killer had not fled the scene, where were they now? As Monsieur Bouc secured the compartment and began the grim task of questioning passengers, each person aboard the stranded train began to realize the true horror of their situation. They were not merely inconvenienced by the weather. They were imprisoned with a murderer who had struck once and might well strike again before rescue arrived. The storm outside seemed to mock their predicament, howling through the mountain passes with vindictive fury. Inside the Orient Express, once a symbol of civilization's triumph over distance and difficulty, 23 passengers and crew members faced the primitive reality that somewhere among them walked a killer who had transformed their luxurious journey into a nightmare of suspicion and fear. The stage was set for a confrontation between order and chaos, between the thin veneer of civilized society and the dark impulses that lurked beneath. In the morning, when pale alpine sunlight struggled through the storm clouds, they would need answers. They would need justice. Most of all, they would need someone capable of seeing through the lies and deceptions that were certain to multiply in the claustrophobic confines of their mobile prison. But for now, in the deep silence of the mountain night, broken only by the wind's relentless assault, in the occasional creak of metal contracting in the cold, there was only the dead man in compartment E, and the terrible knowledge that his killer walked among them, wearing the mask of innocence while harboring the soul of a murderer. The night had yielded no answers, only a deepening of the snow and the silence, until the pale light of dawn crept through the frost-rimmed windows and found the passengers of the Orient Express gathered in the dining car. The storm had neither abated nor relented in its grip. The train, a marvel of civilization, was now a gilded cage. Monsieur Bouc, his usual affability replaced by a grave composure, stood at the head of the assembled company, flanked by the conductor Pierre Michel. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his accent more pronounced in the tension of the moment. "No one may leave first class until the authorities arrive. We are all for the time each other's company and witnesses. Passports will be collected, and every name taken. Calm must prevail." Calm, however, was a brittle shell over a mass of frayed nerves. Foster, the valet, sat near the samovar, clutching a soiled handkerchief, his eyes hollow. "Yes, I had a duplicate key," he repeated, voice thin. "Mr. Fairfax dismissed me at 10:15. I heard what I thought was his voice near 11, a low call, then nothing." His hands shook. "He never called for me twice. Never." Lady Pemberton, formidable in black silk, refused to mask her indignation. "Surely the window latches ought to be double secured," she demanded, her companion Miss Hartwell beside her, pale, fingers marked with ink. When pressed, Lady Pemberton bristled, "I do not eavesdrop, Monsieur Bouc." Miss Hartwell hesitated, then confessed to fetching aspirin at 10:30 and passing a tall man in a dark cloak near compartment E. "He was moving slowly," she whispered, as if counting his steps. Count Andrigny, posture rigid as if on parade, admitted he had quarreled with Fairfax over a family letter during tea. "It was promised, then withdrawn," he said, clipped. His wife Elena sat beside him, her gaze downcast, one hand pressed to her wrist, as if steadying her pulse. When asked if money had been offered, the Count shut his mouth. These are not matters for the dining car. Rumors of their family's dwindling fortune and Elena's mysterious past flickered at the edge of conversation. Dr. Constantine maintained a veneer of clinical detachment. "The blade struck the right ventricle," he reported. "The hand was practiced or very lucky. Less than an hour dead when I saw him." He had been reading since 10, he said, and had not been disturbed. Yet when asked if he had known Fairfax, he hesitated before replying, "Only as one meets an acquaintance on a platform." Professor Bouc, the archaeologist, looked troubled. "We dined together in Vienna," he said, his voice heavy. "Fairfax boasted of an Anatolian tablet he had no right to possess. We argued, but I argue, about many things." He glanced at the ceiling, as if appealing to ancient gods for patience. Mr. Samuel Ratchet, the American, spoke with forced calm. "I sell motor parts, not manuscripts," he insisted. His secretary, Mr. McQueen, face shadowed by exhaustion, added, "Fairfax knew my father, a classicist, but I know nothing of their business." He had been writing letters in the salon from 10 until nearly 11:30, which Mrs. Hubbard could confirm. Mrs. Hubbard, her usual effusiveness tempered by fear, insisted she had been in her compartment, door bolted, but recalled a click in the corridor at 11:15, like a key turned softly. She bristled at the suggestion she imagined things. "I have 3 sons-in-law. None believe me, but I am not given to flights of fancy." Princess Dragomirov, regal and impassive, sipped her tea. "Mr. Fairfax sought to use people for his own ends," she pronounced. "He wrote to me in Paris with an offer I declined." Pressed for details, she closed her eyes. "I am not obliged to repeat vulgar proposals." Pierre Michel, notebook in hand, recounted his rounds at 10 and 10:30, fetching a blanket for a lady in second class, before returning via the first-class corridor at 10:40. No one was near compartment E then. At 11:05, the lamp in E cast a shadow moving within. I assumed it was Mr. Fairfax. Others, Miss O'Rourke, the governess, and Monsieur Vallon, the illusionist, were briefly questioned. Miss O'Rourke heard nothing. Vallon told sharply to put away his cards, only smiled. The chef from the kitchen stared at his hands, silent. The letter opener, marked with the Orient Express monogram and a distinctive scratch, had been missing from a set since the afternoon before. The night steward recalled it but had not reported it, an oversight that now loomed large. Monsieur Bouc surveyed the tense room, the air thick with secrets and suspicion. "If any person possesses a duplicate key besides this gentleman," he said, nodding to Foster, "you will speak now." Silence followed, weighted with implication. "We will rest," Bouc concluded. "In the morning, compartments will be inspected. Until then, we are together, until the snow permits otherwise." The circle of suspects, bound by fear and uncertainty, tightened. The game of deduction had begun. The morning brought an unexpected salvation to the stranded passengers of the Orient Express. Monsieur Bouc's relief was palpable as he announced that Hercule Poirot, the renowned Belgian detective, had been traveling on a connecting service when the storm struck and had agreed to assist with their predicament. The name rippled through the dining car with varying degrees of recognition. Lady Pemberton straightened with obvious approval, while Princess Dragomirov nodded with imperial satisfaction. Poirot's entrance was nothing if not memorable. Despite the treacherous conditions that had brought him to their train, he appeared immaculate, his patent leather shoes gleaming, his magnificent mustache waxed to perfection, his dark suit pressed without a wrinkle. Everything about him spoke of meticulous order, from the precise knot of his tie to the way he removed his gloves with deliberate care. His keen eyes swept the assembled company, cataloguing each face with the systematic precision of a master craftsman examining his materials. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his accent lending gravity to each syllable, "I am Hercule Poirot. I understand that death has visited your distinguished company under most peculiar circumstances." He paused, allowing his gaze to rest momentarily on each passenger. The locked room, the precise wound, the undisturbed surroundings. These things speak to me of a mind both clever and desperate. His first priority was the crime scene itself. In compartment E, accompanied by Monsieur Bouc and Dr. Constantin, Poirot moved with the reverence of a scholar entering a sacred library. He examined the door, the window latch, the keyhole. Not touching, merely observing with the intensity of a man reading an ancient manuscript. The compartment, he noted aloud, declared a life arranged for absolute control. Every possession was precisely placed, papers squared with mathematical accuracy, yet something subtle disturbed the perfect order. "A room betrays character," he murmured, straightening a photograph that had been displaced by perhaps a quarter-inch. "And this room speaks of a man who trusted no one, yet was betrayed by someone he admitted willingly." He knelt beside the body, studying the angle of the wound with clinical detachment. The killer possessed either considerable anatomical knowledge or extraordinary fortune, as Dr. Constantin has observed. But I think, mes amis, we are dealing with knowledge, not luck. His attention turned to details others had overlooked. Fairfax's shoes bore the faintest trace of corridor grit, freshly acquired. The writing desk's blotter showed evidence of hasty correspondence, inconsistent with the deceased's fastidious habits. Most intriguingly, Poirot detected a ghost of wintergreen in the air. Not tobacco, not cologne, but something medicinal that lingered like an unwelcome memory. Returning to the dining car, Poirot addressed the assembled suspects with courteous authority that bound them more effectively than any police interrogation. "We shall proceed with method," he announced. "First, I must understand not merely what each of you did, but what you felt, what you thought. For motive, my friends, is a far more potent weapon than any blade." His brief interactions with the passengers revealed a master psychologist at work. Foster, the valet, he observed with particular interest, noting the man's devotion to order and his genuine shock at hearing his employer call twice, something that had never happened before. Miss Hartwell's ink-stained fingers, hastily concealed, suggested recent correspondence under stress. Count Andreni's military bearing couldn't quite hide his underlying desperation, while his wife Elena's protective gesture toward her wrist spoke of old wounds, perhaps literal ones. Dr. Constantine's medical bag snapped shut with authority, yet Poirot detected something personal in the physician's earlier examination of Fairfax. The American contingent, Ratchet and McQueen, balanced frankness with caution in a way that suggested practiced deception. Mrs. Hubbard's nervous volubility had the ring of truth, while Princess Dragomirov's imperial composure suggested memories she preferred to keep buried. Each of you, Poirot observed quietly, possessed some connection to the deceased. Some knew him personally, others by reputation. But someone among you knew him well enough to gain access to his compartment, well enough to strike with precision, and clever enough to escape from a locked room. His eyes glittered with the anticipation of a master craftsman about to begin his greatest work. The little gray cells, they assure me that this puzzle, however complex, will yield its secrets to patient analysis. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, but within the elegant confines of the Orient Express, Hercule Poirot had begun the methodical process that would transform chaos into order, deception into truth, and mystery into justice. The pale afternoon light filtered through frost-etched windows as Hercule Poirot arranged his interview space in the salon car with characteristic precision. He positioned himself at a small table near the observation windows, his notebook open before him, fountain pen poised with mathematical exactness. Each passenger would face not only his penetrating gaze, but also the stark reminder of their isolation in the frozen wilderness beyond the glass. Foster, the devoted valet, entered first, his grief still raw but his professional composure intact. Poirot observed the man's meticulous attention to his own appearance despite the circumstances, a telling detail about his character. "Monsieur Foster," Poirot began gently, "you served Mr. Fairfax with dedication. Tell me of his final evening, not merely what happened, but what felt different." Foster's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "Mr. Fairfax received a telegram that afternoon, Monsieur Poirot. Most unusual, he burned it immediately after reading, which was not his custom. He kept everything, you understand? Every scrap of paper had value to him." The valet paused, collecting himself. At dinner, he seemed expectant, as if waiting for something. When he dismissed me at 10:15, he said, "That will be all, Foster. Not as usual, you may go." Small differences, but I noticed them. Lady Pemberton swept in with the bearing of a woman accustomed to commanding boardrooms and bending others to her will. Her shipping fortune had been built on reading people's weaknesses, yet she studied Poirot with wary respect. Fairfax was a blackmailer, pure and simple, she declared without preamble. He approached me in London last month, claiming to possess documents regarding my late husband's wartime shipping contracts. I told him precisely where he could deposit his threats. Miss Hartwell followed, visibly trembling, her ink-stained fingers betraying recent correspondence under stress. The wintergreen scent that clung faintly to her clothing did not escape Poirot's notice. "I did see someone near compartment E," she whispered. "But it wasn't a stranger. It was someone from our party, moving deliberately, as if they knew exactly where they were going. The corridor was dim, but they wore a dark coat with the collar raised high. Count Andreni maintained his military bearing, though Poirot detected the subtle signs of a man under tremendous pressure. Fairfax possessed a letter written by my father-in-law during the Revolution, he admitted stiffly. It contained compromising information about certain loyalties. My wife's family suffered greatly during those times." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Elena knows nothing of this arrangement. She believes her family's honor remains intact." When Elena Andreni took her turn, Poirot noted the ethereal quality of her beauty was marred by something haunted in her eyes. She spoke little, but her slight tremor when mentioning the faint medicinal scent she had noticed in the corridor did not escape his attention. Dr. Constantine proved more forthcoming than expected, his tired eyes reflecting old pain. "I knew Fairfax from our university days," he revealed. "We were friends once before he discovered that knowledge could be more profitable than healing. He threatened to expose certain irregularities in my practice. Patients treated without proper documentation, fees waived for those who couldn't pay. In Greece, such compassion can be construed as fraud." The American businessman Ratchet maintained his confident facade, but his secretary McQueen's nervous energy told a different story. When questioned separately, the young man's composure cracked. "My father was Professor McQueen at Harvard. Fairfax acquired some of his research through questionable means, then published it under his own name. Dad never recovered from the scandal. He died thinking his life's work had been stolen." Mrs. Hubbard's usual chattiness gave way to unusual precision when recounting the previous evening. "I heard footsteps in the corridor at exactly 10:45, she stated firmly. "Measured, careful steps, not hurried at all. Then a soft click, like a key turning very quietly. I thought it odd. Passengers don't usually visit each other so late, especially not with such stealth." Princess Dragomirov entered with regal composure that seemed unshakable until Poirot mentioned a specific name from the Russian émigré community. Her imperial mask slipped for just an instant, revealing something that might have been grief or rage. "Fairfax destroyed good men for profit," she said finally. "He possessed documents that could have cleared innocent names, but he chose to let honorable people die in exile rather than surrender his leverage." The remaining passengers? Monsieur Vallon with his theatrical cape, the governess Miss O'Rourke with her prim disapproval, Professor Bouc with his scholarly indignation, each added their threads to the tapestry of motives surrounding Augustus Fairfax. The conductor, Pierre Michel, confirmed his rounds with professional precision, though Poirot noted the man's unusual nervousness when discussing the locked compartment. As evening approached and the storm continued its relentless assault, Poirot sat alone in the salon car, his notebook filled with testimonies that painted Fairfax as a man who had weaponized knowledge against those who had trusted him. The recurring scent of wintergreen, the careful timing of movements, the web of old grievances and fresh desperation, all formed a pattern that his little grey cells were beginning to decipher. Each interview had revealed not just alibis and motives, but the subtle behavioral details that would prove crucial to solving the locked room mystery. Someone among these civilized passengers had committed murder with surgical precision, then vanished from a sealed compartment like a magician's assistant. The key to understanding how lay not in the physical impossibility, but in the psychological necessity that had driven someone to such desperate measures. The discovery came at precisely 3 o'clock, when Pierre Michel's methodical search of the service areas yielded what appeared to be the final piece of the puzzle. Hidden beneath a stack of pristine tablecloths in the dining car's linen cupboard, wrapped in brown paper like a guilty secret, lay a blood-stained handkerchief bearing the embroidered initial C. The fabric was fine Irish linen, the sort carried by gentlemen of breeding, and the crimson stains had dried to the color of old wine. Monsieur Bouc's relief was palpable as he examined the evidence with trembling fingers. "Count Andrigny," he breathed, his voice heavy with the weight of revelation. "The initial, the quality of the linen, the access to the dining car, it all points to the Count." The assembled passengers received this news with a mixture of shock and satisfaction. Here, at last, was a solution that made sense. The desperate aristocrat, facing financial ruin and the exposure of his family's wartime secrets, driven to murder by the twin pressures of honor and necessity. Count Andrigny himself received the accusation with the rigid composure of a military man facing a firing squad. His wife Elena clutched his arm, her ethereal beauty transformed by terror into something almost spectral. "It is not possible," she whispered, but her voice carried no conviction, only the hollow echo of hope dying. The Count's own silence spoke volumes, not the outrage of innocence, but the terrible dignity of a man who has accepted his fate. Dr. Constantine nodded with clinical detachment. The wound was precise, suggesting either medical knowledge or military training. The Count's background in the cavalry would have provided him with intimate knowledge of anatomy. Mrs. Hubbard, ever ready with supporting testimony, recalled seeing a tall figure in the corridor at the crucial time. "Military bearing," she declared with newfound certainty. "I should have recognized it immediately." Even Princess Dragomirov, that bastion of aristocratic solidarity, seemed to accept the inevitable. "Honor," she murmured, "can drive men to extremes that reason cannot justify." Lady Pemberton's practical mind found satisfaction in the solution's completeness. Motive, means, opportunity, and now physical evidence tied together with bureaucratic neatness. The handkerchief itself told a compelling story. The blood was fresh enough to have come from the previous evening. The hiding place suggested someone with intimate knowledge of the train's layout, and the quality of the linen spoke of aristocratic ownership. Most damning of all, Count Andreni's own handkerchief was conspicuously absent from his personal effects, discovered missing during Pierre Michel's thorough search of his compartment. But Hercule Poirot sat in the salon car, like a statue of contemplation, his magnificent mustache bristling with intellectual displeasure. His keen eyes studied not the blood-stained evidence, but the faces around him, reading the subtle signs of relief and satisfaction with the growing unease of a master craftsman observing shoddy workmanship. "None," he said quietly, the single word cutting through the atmosphere of collective resolution like a blade through silk. "This solution, it offends the little grey cells. It is too convenient, too perfectly arranged, like a stage set designed to deceive the audience in the cheap seats." He rose from his chair with deliberate precision, his patent leather shoes clicking against the floor in measured rhythm. "Consider, if you please, the psychology of this crime. We are asked to believe that Count Andreni, a man whose entire life has been built upon the foundation of honor and military discipline, would commit murder and then hide the evidence in the most obvious location possible. A soldier does not leave his calling card at the scene of his crime." Poirot began to pace the narrow confines of the salon car, his movements as precise as a clockwork mechanism. "Furthermore, observe the timing of this discovery. The handkerchief is found at the exact moment when our investigation threatens to expose uncomfortable truths about several passengers. How convenient that we should discover evidence pointing to the one man, whose motive is already established and whose guilt would satisfy our desire for a neat conclusion." The assembled passengers shifted uncomfortably as Poirot's logic began to dismantle their collective relief. Count Andreni himself looked up with something that might have been gratitude, while his wife's grip on his arm loosened slightly as hope began to flicker in her eyes. "The real murderer," Poirot continued, warming to his theme, "understood that suspicion would naturally fall upon those with obvious motives. They have provided us with evidence that confirms our prejudices while concealing their own involvement. This handkerchief is not proof of guilt. It is proof of a mind sophisticated enough to manipulate our expectations." He paused before the frost-covered window, his reflection ghost-like in the darkening glass. "The locked room mystery remains unsolved, mes amis. The true killer walks among us still, hidden behind a mask of false concern and manufactured evidence. We have been led down a garden path designed to satisfy our desire for simple answers to complex questions." As the implications of Poirot's words settled over the stranded passengers like a shroud, the comfortable certainty of solved mystery gave way to renewed fear. If Count Andreni was innocent, then the real murderer remained free, patient, and undoubtedly preparing their next move in this deadly game of deception and misdirection. The storm outside seemed to mock their predicament, its howling wind a reminder that they remained trapped with a killer whose sophistication exceeded their initial assumptions. The first false lead had been exposed, but in doing so, Poirot had revealed that they faced an adversary far more dangerous than any of them had imagined. Poirot's dismissal of the convenient evidence against Count Andraigne had shattered the fragile peace that had settled over the dining car, like thin ice cracking under pressure. The detective understood that his adversary, having failed with their first gambit, would now be forced into more desperate measures. It was time to apply the sort of methodical psychological pressure that had made his reputation, not the crude intimidation of a police interrogation, but the subtle manipulation of a master psychologist who understood that guilt, like water, always finds its way to the surface. He arranged the salon car with characteristic precision, positioning chairs in a careful semicircle that would allow him to observe every facial expression, every nervous gesture, every telltale sign of discomfort. The storm outside pressed against the windows like a living thing, but inside, Poirot created an atmosphere of clinical examination that was far more unsettling than any natural phenomenon. "We shall conduct a small experiment," he announced with a courteous authority that brooked no argument. "Not accusations, mes amis, but observations. The human mind, it is like a stage. Sometimes the actor forgets they are performing." He began with props, requesting that Pierre Michel hang each passenger's outer garments on the brass hooks along the wall. "Fabric remembers," he murmured, watching faces carefully. "A brushed sleeve, a transferred fragrance, the ghost of contact." Miss Hartwell's eyes flickered involuntarily toward her coat, while Dr. Constantine's medical bag snapped shut with unnecessary force. Next came the letter openers, two identical implements, save for the minute scratch that marked one as the murder weapon. Poirot moved among the passengers with deliberate slowness, noting whose gaze slid immediately to the telltale imperfection, whose breathing quickened, whose hands betrayed the slightest tremor of recognition. Count Andraigne met his examination with newfound composure, while Mrs. Hubbard held her breath entirely. The handwriting exercise proved particularly revealing. "Write for me, if you please." "The truth is very simple," Poirot requested, distributing cards and fountain pens. He watched not the words, but the writers, who adjusted their grip with practiced ease, who favored their left hand, who pressed with scholarly force. When Miss Hartwell reached for the pen, that faint wintergreen scent drifted past him again, and he observed her wince as the nib caught on the paper's grain. But it was his reconstruction of the corridor that proved most illuminating. With the precision of a theatrical director, he positioned passengers at key locations, dimmed the lights, and asked them to recreate their movements from the previous evening. Mrs. Hubbard nodded sharply when Pierre Michel's demonstration key produced the soft click she remembered. Monsieur Vallon, the illusionist, cast a shadow against compartment I's window that made the conductor start despite himself. "An illusion need not be perfect," Poirot observed quietly. "It need only exploit what we expect to see." Throughout these exercises, he wove a web of seemingly casual observations that struck like surgical strikes against carefully constructed alibis. To Dr. Constantine, he remarked on the precision required to strike the right ventricle, watching the physician's professional pride war with caution. To Miss Hartwell, he mentioned aspirin's wintergreen scent, noting how Elena Andreigne's hand moved unconsciously to her wrist. To young McQueen, he commented on the scholarly pressure evident on Fairfax's blotter, observing the secretary's Adam's apple bob nervously. Each comment was delivered with the casual air of academic interest, yet Poirot's keen eyes catalogued every reaction, every suppressed start, every moment of recognition quickly concealed. He spoke of telegrams burned in haste, watching Princess Dragomirov's fan flutter. He mentioned the peculiar timing of corridor sounds, observing who nodded in confirmation and who looked genuinely puzzled. The psychological pressure built systematically, like a master musician building toward a crescendo. Passengers began to shift uncomfortably, realizing that their every word and gesture was being analyzed with scientific precision. The comfortable certainty of solved mystery had given way to the terrible knowledge that they were all suspects in a game whose rules only Poirot understood. "This train," he concluded, rising with dignified authority, "is a theatre. Last night we witnessed a melodrama. Cries in the night, a locked door, a shadow upon a blind. It was written for an audience that prefers simple solutions to complex truths, but I do not sit in the cheap seats." He paused, allowing his gaze to rest on each face in turn. "Tonight we shall perform a second act. The killer has revealed more than they intended through their very cleverness. They possess knowledge they should not have, demonstrate skills they have tried to conceal, and most fatally, they have underestimated the little gray cells." As the passengers dispersed to their compartments, each carrying the weight of Poirot's penetrating analysis, the detective remained in the salon car, his notebook filled with observations that were slowly forming a pattern. The psychological game was fully engaged now, and somewhere among these civilized facades walked a killer who was beginning to realize that their masterful performance had contained fatal flaws visible only to the most observant of audiences. The storm continued its assault, but inside the Orient Express, Hercule Poirot had begun the delicate process of unraveling a web of deception that would soon trap its own creator. The crisis that shattered the pre-dawn quiet came not with violence, but with the acrid sweetness of wintergreen oil saturating the air like a medicinal fog. Lady Pemberton's frantic hammering on Poirot's compartment door at 4:30 brought the detective rushing to find Miss Hartwell collapsed in her narrow berth, a overturned teacup beside her, and the unmistakable scent of oil of wintergreen thick enough to make one's eyes water. Dr. Constantine arrived within moments, his medical bag snapping open with practiced efficiency. "Methyl salicylate poisoning," he diagnosed grimly, checking pulse and respiration. "Taken in this concentration, it could have been fatal. She's consumed enough to make her violently ill, but not quite enough to kill, if we act immediately." His hands moved with clinical precision, administering the crude but effective remedies available on the train. Strong tea, salt water, anything to purge the poison from her system. On the writing table lay a single sheet of Orient Express stationery, covered in neat, unwavering script. "I cannot bear the shame of what I have done. The guilt consumes me. Forgive me. S.H." But Poirot's keen eyes immediately detected the deception that had escaped the others. The handwriting, while superficially similar to Miss Hartwell's usual script, lacked the subtle leftward slant he had observed during yesterday's writing exercise. More tellingly, the teacup sat on the right side of the table, though Miss Hartwell's ink-stained left fingers had clearly marked her as naturally left-handed. "This is not suicide," Poirot announced with quiet authority, examining the scene with the reverence of a scholar reading ancient manuscripts. "This is attempted murder, staged to appear as confession and self-destruction. Our killer grows desperate, mes amis, and desperation makes even the cleverest criminal careless." Miss Hartwell stirred weakly, her dilated pupils struggling to focus on Poirot's concerned face. "I went for aspirin," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm's continued assault. "My headache. Someone knocked, very softly. When I opened the door, there was no one there, just a cup of tea on the floor with a note saying Lady Pemberton had sent it for my nerves." Her breathing grew labored. "The taste was wrong, too sweet, but I was so tired." It was then that Miss O'Rourke, the governess, appeared in the doorway, her sensible wrapper clutched tightly around her thin frame. "I must speak," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of terrible knowledge. "I should have said something yesterday, but I wasn't certain. I saw Mr. Fairfax 3 days ago in Vienna, at the Hotel Imperial. He was arguing with someone in the lobby, a woman whose voice I recognized from this train." Poirot's moustache bristled with interest. "Continue, mademoiselle. Every detail may prove crucial." The governess's trained eye for observation, honed by years of supervising children and their elaborate deceptions, had noted specifics that proved invaluable. The woman wore expensive gloves despite the warm weather, and she moved with careful grace, the sort that suggests either advanced age or old injury carefully concealed. Her voice carried clearly. She spoke of justice delayed but not denied, of accounts that must finally be settled. When she turned slightly, I glimpsed aristocratic features, the bone structure that speaks of generations of breeding. Most significantly, Miss O'Rourke had witnessed the woman drop something as she departed, a small glass vial that had rolled under a lobby chair. I retrieved it, thinking she might return, the governess explained, producing the empty bottle from her reticule. Aspirin powder, the expensive kind prescribed for delicate constitutions. It retained this same wintergreen scent that has haunted our investigation. Poirot accepted the vial with the reverence due a holy relic, his little gray cells working at fever pitch to process these revelations. The attempted murder of Miss Hartwell was not random desperation. It was a calculated strike against someone whose knowledge posed a specific threat. Her position as Lady Pemberton's companion, her skill with correspondence and shorthand, her nervous habit of noting details others missed, all had made her dangerous to someone whose carefully constructed deception was beginning to unravel. The killer revealed themselves through this very attack, Poirot observed, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. Only someone present during our interviews could know which of Miss Hartwell's observations posed the greatest threat. Only someone with intimate knowledge of her habits could have known about her midnight aspirin ritual. Most tellingly, only someone with access to concentrated wintergreen oil could have prepared this particular poison. He began to pace the narrow confines of the compartment, his patent leather shoes clicking against the floor in rhythm with his accelerating thoughts. The forged suicide note, the staged scene, the precise dosage calculated to incapacitate rather than kill immediately, all speak of a mind both educated and ruthless. Our murderer possesses medical knowledge, aristocratic bearing, and the cold calculation necessary to kill twice rather than face exposure. The wintergreen scent that had haunted the investigation from its beginning now revealed its true significance. Not merely the ghost of aspirin tablets, but the deliberate signature of someone who used their supposed frailty as both weapon and disguise. The little gray cells had found their pattern at last, and Poirot's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a master craftsman about to complete his greatest work. As Miss Hartwell was carefully moved to the safety of the dining car under Dr. Constantine's supervision, and as the other passengers gathered in fearful clusters, Poirot remained in the poisoned compartment, his mind assembling the final pieces of a puzzle that would soon trap its own creator in a web of irrefutable logic. The snowstorm pressed relentlessly against the windows as Poirot paced the narrow corridor, the events of the last night playing and replaying in his mind. The attempted poisoning of Miss Hartwell, so carefully staged as suicide, had revealed the true nature of the adversary he faced. Not merely a murderer, but a meticulous manipulator who thrived on misdirection and calculated risk. Poirot began his morning by returning to the crime scene, compartment E. He moved with the precision of a scholar, touching nothing but letting his eyes linger over every detail. At the writing desk, he examined the blotter, holding it up to the light, then to the small mirror above the washstand. There, faint but unmistakable, were the imprints of a message hastily written, fragments that hinted at a secret meeting and a promise unfulfilled. The pressure of the writing told him more than the words. Fairfax had been tense, expectant, and not alone in his anticipation. Near the keyhole, Poirot found a blue fibre, caught in a splinter of metal. It was almost invisible, but nothing escaped his gaze. He tucked it away as he pondered its source. On the washstand, a subtle smear of beeswax caught the light, a residue left by patient hands, perhaps used to smooth a thread or silence a mechanism. Each clue, mundane in isolation, formed a mosaic of method and intent. He turned his attention to the window and its blind. The frost was undisturbed, but the lower hem of the blind held a faint notch, as though a thread had once drawn it taut. Poirot recreated the scene with a hat on the peg and a coat thrown just so, casting a shadow that, from the corridor, would appear as a man moving inside. The illusion was simple, but effective, an act designed to provide a false alibi at a crucial moment. Poirot next visited the galley, where he questioned the chef about the brown paper found in the linen cupboard. The chef, after some hesitation, produced a roll used only for new deliveries, free from the stains of kitchen work. Poirot compared the fibers and nicks, finding a match to the paper that had wrapped the damning handkerchief. The implication was clear. The evidence against Count Andrigny had been planted with intent and forethought, not desperation. He then asked to inspect the gloves of the passengers. Lady Pemberton's were marked with salt and coal dust, a legacy of her shipping empire. Elena Andrigny's gloves were new but showed the nervous stretching of worry. Princess Dragomirov's, however, revealed faint stains of wintergreen and camphor, scents associated with both age and the medicinal preparations that featured so prominently in the case. Poirot returned them with a polite nod, his mind racing through the implications. In the dining car, where Miss Hartwell now rested under Dr. Constantine's care, Poirot discreetly examined the physician's medical kit. The liniments and tinctures there included wintergreen, but diluted, masked by other odors. Poirot knew the scent at the crime scene was stronger, more deliberate, more personal. The little vial from Vienna, produced by Miss O'Rourke, provided another piece of the puzzle. Its label, half torn, bore the mark of an exclusive apothecary, and the thread of beeswax at its stopper matched that found on the washstand. A habit, perhaps, of someone accustomed to preparing their own medicines for both comfort and concealment. Poirot's systematic review did not neglect the staff. He revisited Pierre Michel's account of his rounds, confirming the timing of the shadow seen in compartment E. The corridor rug, he learned, had been slightly curled at the crucial time, a sign, perhaps, of a thread drawn taut to animate the scene for a watching eye. Throughout, Poirot's focus returned time and again to the psychology of the crime. The murderer was not merely clever with their hands, but with their mind, arranging evidence, manipulating perceptions, exploiting the assumptions of both the innocent and the suspicious. The failed attempt on Miss Hartwell's life was the act of someone feeling the walls close in, someone who understood that her sharp eyes and careful notes had come too close to the truth. By late afternoon, Poirot sat in quiet contemplation, the clues arrayed in his mind like chess pieces. He wrote several brief notes and dispatched them via Pierre Michel, requesting that certain passengers bring specific personal items, a glove, a vial, a spool of thread, to the salon car that evening. The time for secrets was ending. Poirot did not yet announce his solution. The tangled web of physical and psychological evidence had revealed to him the murderer's identity, method, and motive. But for now, as dusk gathered and the passengers awaited his summons, he let the tension build. The stage was set for the final gathering, where the truth at last would be made undeniable by the little gray cells. The salon car had been transformed into a theater of justice, its elegant brass fittings gleaming under the electric lights like instruments of truth waiting to be wielded. Poirot had arranged the seating with mathematical precision, each passenger positioned to allow optimal observation of facial expressions, nervous gestures, and the subtle betrayals of guilt that no amount of breeding could entirely conceal. The storm outside had finally begun to show signs of weakening, but within the Orient Express, the atmosphere crackled with tension more electric than any lightning. The stage is set. Mesdames et messieurs, Poirot began, rising with the dignity of a master conductor about to lead his orchestra through its most complex symphony. We have journeyed together through a labyrinth of deception, misdirection, and carefully orchestrated lies. Tonight, we reach the heart of that maze, where truth awaits those courageous enough to confront it. Upon the green baize of his improvised table lay the physical evidence that had accumulated like pieces of an intricate puzzle: the silver letter opener with its telltale scratch, the blood-stained handkerchief in its revealing brown paper wrapping, the tiny blue fiber in its glassine envelope, and the small glass vial that had started their investigation in Vienna. Each item seemed to pulse with significance under the warm glow of the lamps. The method revealed. The murder of Augustus Fairfax was not a crime of passion, Poirot declared, his keen eyes sweeping the assembled faces. Nor was it the desperate act of a cornered victim. It was the culmination of a plan conceived in patience and executed with the precision of a master surgeon, combined with the cunning of a theatrical illusionist. He moved to demonstrate with props borrowed from the dining car, his patent leather shoes clicking against the floor in measured rhythm. The locked room that so mystified us was, in reality, an elaborate stage set designed to create an impossible crime. The killer understood that we would focus on the physical impossibility rather than the psychological necessity that drove them to such desperate measures. With theatrical precision, Poirot recreated the scene using a length of strong embroidery thread, the same type whose blue fiber had been caught in the keyhole's metal burr. The shadow observed by Pierre Michel at 11:05 was not cast by a living occupant, but by carefully arranged clothing animated through this thread system. A coat draped just so, a hat positioned with mathematical accuracy, all manipulated from the corridor to suggest movement within the compartment. The web of evidence. The handkerchief evidence drew his particular attention, his magnificent mustache bristling with intellectual satisfaction. This convenient clue, found beneath the dining car linens, was wrapped in brown paper from a specific kitchen roll, new stock, unmarked by the honest grime of culinary use. It was placed where staff would inevitably discover it when pressure mounted, designed to satisfy our hunger for simple solutions to complex problems. He lifted the tiny glass vial, its torn apothecary label catching the light. In Vienna, Miss O'Rourke witnessed a confrontation between Fairfax and a woman whose voice carried the unmistakable cadence of aristocratic breeding. This vial, dropped in that encounter, bears the residue of beeswax used to seal medicinal preparations, the same waxy substance found on Fairfax's washstand, and the source of that persistent wintergreen scent that has haunted our investigation. The psychological portrait. Our killer possessed intimate knowledge of both medicine and human psychology, Poirot continued, his voice gaining quiet intensity. They understood that suspicion would naturally fall upon those with obvious motives: the desperate count, the threatened doctor, the vengeful American. By providing us with a parade of plausible suspects, they sought to hide their own involvement behind a mask of helpful concern and manufactured evidence. The blue fiber held particular significance in his reconstruction. This single thread, caught at the keyhole, came from fabric of exceptional quality, not the rough wool of a servant's coat or the practical cotton of traveling clothes, but the fine silk or velvet favored by those accustomed to luxury, even in exile. The narrowing circle. As Poirot's methodical revelation progressed, the circle of suspicion began to tighten around certain passengers whose reactions betrayed more than their words. The persistent wintergreen scent, the medical precision of the wound, the sophisticated understanding of human psychology required to orchestrate such elaborate deception, all pointed towards someone whose frail appearance masked both considerable knowledge and implacable determination. The attempted poisoning of Miss Hartwell was not random desperation, he observed, watching carefully as certain passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. It was a calculated strike against someone whose sharp observations and careful documentation threatened to expose truths that had been buried for years. The stage was set for the final revelation, with Poirot's little grey cells having assembled the complete picture of how impossible had been made possible and why justice too long delayed had finally demanded its terrible price. The salon car had become a courtroom where truth would finally triumph over deception, and Hercule Poirot stood before his audience with the quiet authority of a judge about to deliver the most significant verdict of his career. The storm outside seemed to pause in anticipation, as if nature itself awaited the resolution of this intricate puzzle of human passion and calculated revenge. The assembly of evidence. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "we have traveled together through a labyrinth of misdirection, false clues, and carefully orchestrated deceptions. Tonight, the little grey cells reveal the truth that has hidden behind a mask of imperial dignity and aristocratic frailty." Upon his improvised table, the physical evidence lay arranged with mathematical precision. The silver letter opener with its distinctive scratch, the blood-stained handkerchief in its revealing brown paper, the tiny blue silk fiber, and the small glass vial from Vienna. Each piece seemed to pulse with significance under the warm electric lights. "Every clue has pointed toward one individual," Poirot continued, his keen eyes sweeping the assembled faces before settling with laser-like intensity on Princess Dragomirov. "Someone whose supposed weakness masked extraordinary knowledge, whose imperial bearing concealed the heart of an executioner, and whose quest for justice had festered into something far more dangerous." The method unveiled. Princess Dragomirov sat with regal composure, her embroidery work continuing with the same methodical precision that had characterized her throughout the investigation. Only the slightest tightening around her eyes betrayed any reaction to Poirot's penetrating gaze. "Your needlework, Princess, demonstrates the precision of a master surgeon," Poirot observed, approaching her chair with respectful caution. "Each stitch placed with mathematical accuracy, the tension controlled with expert knowledge of how materials respond to pressure. This same expertise guided the blade that pierced Augustus Fairfax's heart with such deadly precision." He lifted the blue silk fiber in its glassine envelope, holding it toward the light. "This single thread, caught in the keyhole's metal burr, came from your embroidery silk, the same shade you use for your most delicate work, but it served a far more sinister purpose than decoration." With theatrical precision, Poirot began his reconstruction of the impossible crime. The locked room that so mystified us was, in reality, an elaborate stage set designed by someone who understood both the mechanics of illusion and the psychology of misdirection. You used your embroidery thread to create a shadow puppet show, animating carefully arranged clothing to suggest movement within the compartment while you were safely establishing your alibi in the corridor. The psychological portrait. "Your medical knowledge," Poirot continued, "came not from formal training but from decades of treating your own ailments and those of fellow émigrés who could not afford proper physicians. The Russian Revolution taught you anatomy from necessity, chemistry from desperation, and psychology from the brutal requirement of survival." The winter-green scent that had haunted their investigation found its source in the princess's silver pillbox, a container whose contents included not merely aspirin, but concentrated oil of wintergreen used to treat the arthritis that made her careful movements a medical necessity rather than an aristocratic affectation. "Your supposed frailty has been your greatest weapon, Princess. You cultivated an image of imperial helplessness while possessing the knowledge and determination of someone who survived revolution through wit rather than fortune. When you requested Pierre Michel's assistance with a sticky lock on your compartment, he naturally provided his master key without question. After all, who would suspect a frail elderly princess of murderous intent? The motive revealed. Princess Dragomirov's embroidery needle paused for the first time since Poirot had begun his revelation, her aristocratic mask cracking slightly as he approached the heart of her motivation. In 1919, your daughter Sonia attempted to flee Russia with documents that could have cleared the names of innocent nobles falsely accused of collaboration with the Bolsheviks. Augustus Fairfax intercepted those papers, not to preserve history or protect the innocent, but to exploit human suffering for profit. The terrible truth emerged with methodical precision. Sonia died in exile, believing her father's honor was forever stained by false accusations. Fairfax possessed the documents that could have saved her reputation and her will to live, but he chose to let her die in despair rather than surrender his leverage over your family. For 26 years, Poirot continued with quiet intensity, you have lived with the knowledge that your daughter died believing her family dishonored. You discovered Fairfax aboard this train and saw an opportunity for the justice that law and time had failed to provide. The final gambit. The telegram Fairfax burned that afternoon was your invitation, wasn't it? You promised him additional documents, perhaps photographs of papers he had long sought. He agreed to meet you in his compartment at 10:30, his greed overcoming his usual caution. Poirot's reconstruction painted a picture of calculated vengeance executed with surgical precision. You entered his compartment using Pierre Michel's key, struck with the accuracy born of desperate knowledge, then departed, locking the door behind you and returning the key with gracious thanks for the conductor's courtesy. But your greatest achievement was the psychological manipulation of your fellow passengers. You understood that each carried guilt or secrets that would make them plausible suspects. By planting the blood-stained handkerchief wrapped in kitchen paper, you exploited our prejudices while remaining above suspicion yourself. The confession. Princess Dragomirov set down her embroidery with the dignity of a monarch acknowledging defeat. The blue silk thread in her work matched perfectly the fiber caught in the keyhole, and her silver pillbox bore the same beeswax seal found on Fairfax's washstand. You have reconstructed events with admirable accuracy, Monsieur Poirot, she said, her voice retaining its aristocratic authority, even in confession. Yes, I killed Augustus Fairfax, and I would kill him again given the opportunity. He destroyed good people for profit, letting honor die while he prospered from others' suffering. Her admission carried no remorse, only the terrible satisfaction of justice finally served after decades of patient waiting. Sonia died believing her family was dishonored when Fairfax possessed the very documents that could have cleared our name. He preferred to watch us suffer, to use our pain as currency in his marketplace of human misery. The final judgment. Poirot regarded her with the complex mixture of admiration and sadness that characterized his encounters with criminals whose motives, if not their methods, commanded a certain respect. The salon car fell silent, except for the wind's continued assault outside, as the assembled passengers absorbed the revelation that their elegant fellow traveler had been both judge and executioner. The attempted poisoning of Miss Hartwell revealed your desperation as my investigation closed in, Poirot observed quietly. Her sharp eyes had noticed too much. The quality of your gloves, the scent of your medications, the precision of your movements when you thought yourself unobserved. Princess Dragomirov nodded with imperial dignity. She was becoming dangerous to my carefully constructed performance. I calculated the dosage to incapacitate rather than kill. I am not a monster, Monsieur Poirot, merely an instrument of delayed justice. As the storm outside finally began to show signs of weakening, Hercule Poirot stood in the warm glow of the salon car lights, having once again demonstrated that no crime, however cleverly conceived, could withstand the methodical application of logic and psychological insight. The little grey cells had triumphed, but victory carried its own burden of understanding the human cost of justice too long denied. The case of the Orient Express murder was closed, but the moral Complexities it revealed would linger long after the snow had melted and the train had resumed its journey towards civilization. Dawn crept across the Austrian Alps with the reluctant persistence of truth itself, its pale light revealing not only the rescue crews cutting their methodical path through the diminishing snowfall, but also the moral landscape that Princess Dragomirov's confession had exposed within the elegant confines of the Orient Express. The approaching sound of voices and machinery carried with it the promise of return to civilization, yet also the inexorable approach of official justice that would transform their intimate drama into a matter of legal procedure. The weight of revelation. Princess Dragomirov sat with the composed dignity of a monarch who had finally laid down her crown, her embroidery work folded with the same meticulous care she had brought to planning Augustus Fairfax's death. The other passengers maintained a respectful distance, their earlier fear now transformed into something far more complex, a mixture of horror at the crime itself and grudging understanding of the decades of patient suffering that had driven her to such desperate measures. Count Andrenyi, cleared of suspicion but bearing the psychological scars of false accusation, approached with his wife Elena. "Princess," he said with formal gravity, "my family owes you a debt that can never be repaid. Fairfax held documents that could have destroyed us as he destroyed so many others." His voice carried the weight of aristocratic honor, finally vindicated, yet tempered by the terrible price of that vindication. Lady Pemberton, ever practical in her assessment of human nature, studied the princess with the calculating gaze that had built her shipping empire. "Fairfax was a blackmailer and a destroyer of lives," she declared without sentimentality. "Perhaps not all justice is found in courtrooms." Miss Hartwell, still pale from her near-fatal poisoning but recovered enough to speak, nodded weakly in agreement, her brush with death lending gravity to her quiet words of support. The approaching machinery of law. Dr. Constantine moved among the passengers with clinical detachment, gathering the medical evidence that would be required for the official investigation. His careful documentation of the wound's precision, the calculated dosage of wintergreen oil, the remarkable anatomical knowledge displayed by someone without formal medical training. "The human mind," he observed to Poirot, "when pushed to its limits by prolonged suffering, can achieve remarkable feats of calculation and endurance." The sound of the rescue crews grew steadily louder, their voices carrying across the snow-covered landscape like harbingers of a return to the mundane world of legal procedures and bureaucratic justice. Monsieur Bouc, whose initial relief at the solved case had given way to profound moral confusion, stood at the frost-covered windows watching their approach with visible anxiety. "My friend," he murmured to Poirot, "how does one explain to the authorities that justice and law are not always the same thing?" Poirot's moral reckoning. Hercule Poirot stood in contemplative silence, his magnificent moustache bristling with the intellectual satisfaction of a puzzle solved, yet his keen eyes reflecting the deeper complexities that no amount of deductive reasoning could resolve. The little grey cells had successfully unraveled the mechanics of the crime, but they continued to grapple with the far more challenging question of whether that crime represented justice delayed or justice perverted. "The law," he said quietly to the assembled passengers, "is a blunt instrument designed to serve society's need for order. But justice is a far more delicate mechanism, one that must weigh not merely actions, but intentions. Not merely crimes, but their context." His gaze rested on Princess Dragomirov with something approaching respect. "Madame, you became an instrument of retribution when all other instruments failed. Yet the cost of such justice is always terrible, both for the one who dispenses it and for those who witness its necessity." The princess's final dignity. Princess Dragomirov rose from her chair with imperial grace, adjusting her veil with the same precision she had brought to every aspect of her elaborate revenge. "Monsieur Poirot," she said with quiet authority, "you have reconstructed my actions with admirable accuracy. I do not ask for understanding, only for the knowledge that Sonia's memory has finally been honored." Her voice carried no remorse, only the terrible satisfaction of justice finally served after decades of patient waiting. The physical evidence lay arranged on Poirot's improvised table like artifacts of a completed ritual. The blue silk thread that had animated her shadow puppet show, the silver letter opener with its telltale scratch, the small glass vial from Vienna that had started their investigation. Each item told its part of the story, but together they formed a narrative that transcended simple categories of guilt and innocence. The moment of transition. As the rescue crews drew near enough for individual voices to be distinguished, Poirot found himself preparing to surrender his prisoner to official custody, while privately acknowledging that the true resolution of the case might never be found in any courtroom. The Orient Express, that symbol of civilization's triumph over distance and difficulty, had become a stage for the eternal conflict between law and justice, between the order that society demanded and the moral complexity that human nature provided. The storm outside had finally begun to break, but within the elegant confines of the railway car, the passengers faced a different kind of weather. The approaching tempest of official investigation, formal charges, and the inexorable process that would transform their intimate drama into a matter of public record and legal precedent. The pale morning light revealed not only the rescue crews cutting their methodical path through the diminishing snowfall, but also the approaching machinery of official justice that would transform their intimate drama into a matter of legal procedure. Inspector Marchand of the French Railway Police boarded with brisk authority, wholly unprepared for the moral labyrinth that awaited him within the elegant confines of the Orient Express. The official confrontation. Monsieur Poirot, Inspector Marchand began, his notebook poised with bureaucratic precision. I understand you have solved this murder and identified the perpetrator? His confidence faltered as Poirot presented the complex web of evidence. Not merely a crime, but a 26-year quest for justice that had culminated in calculated revenge executed with surgical precision. Princess Dragomirov sat with imperial dignity as the inspector absorbed the blue silk thread, the medical knowledge demonstrated in the wound's placement, and the elaborate deception that had transformed the locked compartment into a stage for impossible crime. The evidence is conclusive, Poirot explained with characteristic precision, yet the motive springs from a well of suffering that defies easy categorization. The passenger's testament. As Inspector Marchand prepared to make his arrest, Count Andrigny rose with military bearing. Inspector, Augustus Fairfax was a destroyer of lives, a man who profited from human misery with calculated cruelty. The documents he possessed could have cleared innocent names, yet he chose to let good people die in despair. Lady Pemberton added her direct assessment. Fairfax approached me with blackmail demands. When I refused, he threatened to destroy reputations with fabricated evidence. The man was a cancer upon civilized society. Dr. Constantine nodded gravely, providing testimony about stolen research and destroyed careers. The moment of justice. Princess Dragomirov rose with regal composure, extending her hands toward the inspector with the dignity of a monarch accepting fate. I am prepared to face whatever judgment awaits me, she declared with quiet authority. I've lived to see Sonia's memory honored and Fairfax's evil ended. No earthly court can diminish that satisfaction. The steel handcuffs closed with a soft click, yet dignity clung to her like the faint scent of wintergreen that had betrayed her craft. As she was led away, her back straight and head held high, a profound silence descended upon the remaining passengers, each carrying the weight of witnessing justice, wearing a face very different from legal precedent. Character resolutions. Lady Pemberton approached Miss Hartwell with newfound respect. You will not return to shorthand for petty men. Come to London. I pay for courage as well as competence. Miss Hartwell's eyes shone with gratitude, her near-death experience having altered the course of her life with the soft click of opportunity. Count Andrigny stood with Elena, their hands clasped as the shadow of blackmail finally lifted. "The stain is removed," he murmured to the air where honor lives. Dr. Constantine packed his instruments with ritual gravity, observing to Poirot, "There are crimes that are surgeries, and surgeries that are crimes." Poirot's final wisdom. Hercule Poirot stood in contemplative silence, his keen eyes reflecting complexities that no amount of deductive reasoning could fully resolve. "Inspector," he said quietly, "this case presents us with a fundamental question about justice itself. Is it found in rigid legal statutes or in the moral necessity that drives human beings to seek redress when all other avenues have failed?" His magnificent mustache bristled with intellectual intensity. Princess Dragomirov became judge and executioner because society's institutions failed to protect the innocent from a predator who used respectability as camouflage for systematic cruelty. The elegant departure. As the Orient Express prepared to resume its interrupted journey, the storm had passed, leaving the Austrian Alps gleaming under brilliant sunshine. Monsieur Bouc approached with 2 cups of chocolate, steam rising like the promise of civilization restored. "To a rival," he proposed. Poirot accepted his cup, adjusting his mustaches with characteristic precision. "To a rival," he echoed, "and to departure. For what is a solved case but a train that leaves precisely on time?" His eyes twinkled with gentle humor. "Come, mon ami, let us attend to the only mystery that should remain unsolved on a railway, the recipe by which your chef persuades chocolate to steam, yet never scald." With that gentle nonsense, Hercule Poirot restored the world to its proper size, the little grey cells having once again demonstrated that truth, like the Orient Express itself, may be delayed by storms and obstacles, but always reaches its destination.